This is Austin again from Turbo Lab with another BMW N54 turbo video. In this video, I want to go over the checklist of why your turbos could be blowing oil. And this will also cover if you just installed brand new turbos that are blowing oil. The first thing I would check is if your oil drain is kinked or has some type of clog in it. In this case, this one has collapsed. So most likely, I wouldn't recommend trying to bend it back and reuse it because it will probably go back to that shape. Make sure your oil drain, you have not put RTV gasket on this or an excessive amount, because if you have, it can get inside the drain and start to cause an issue with the oil not being able to flow through the drain, and it backs up into the cartridge and it's just forced out the seals because it can't physically drain like it's supposed to. If you haven't run an air filter on your turbos or on your car or your turbos could have sucked something in them to cause it to throw the wheel out of balance and cause it to blow oil. I saw that in one case recently. In that case, you definitely need a rebuild. In the other cases that I just mentioned, you most likely don't need a rebuild. You just need to fix the issue like this problem here. The next thing that can cause your turbos to blow oil, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they need a rebuild, is if you blocked off your crankcase ventilation and you didn't do that properly. You're not ever supposed to block off the crankcase ventilation. You can vent it to the atmosphere or use a catch can, but if it's not vented properly, what can happen is then your turbos won't drain the oil out because you'll have all this crankcase pressure inside the engine with the pistons moving up and down, and it just won't allow that oil to flow down through the drain because pressure is going back up through the drain. And then the next thing that can cause this issue is if your oil is just too thin, or if you haven't changed your oil on time. So the issue here is keep in mind what the ambient temperature is outside. If it's extremely hot conditions, you need thicker oil. If it's very cold conditions, you can get away with thinner oil. Now, BMW has the requirements of 5W30, but the problem with that is if it's extremely hot outside, that thin of oil can be too thin for turbochargers. Usually, I like to go a 10W30 minimum, just because that's what most cars came with, 10W30 that had Mitsubishi turbos on them. If you have too much oil in the motor, your oil level can be higher than the turbocharger. And if you have that issue, you're going to have more oil being plumbed in, but it's not going to be able to drain. So it's going to be forced out the seals. I also recommend taking a porting tool and port matching this area so it makes a smoother transition from the turbo to the drain, because I see a lot of these turbos that blow oil, but it's clearly a drainage issue. I can tell that it's not a failure issue because the turbos never have any shaft play, or most of them that I worked on. So, extremely important. If your turbos are blowing oil but they don't have any shaft play and they perform really well, then it's most likely a drainage issue. One more thing that I wanted to cover is if you have an aftermarket set of turbos like the Hexons or any other company, just keep in mind that if it does have an issue blowing oil and somebody did an install for you, the first thing I would check is this drain. If it's blowing oil, check that, and then the RTV thing, especially if somebody else did the install. The next thing is, if you checked all that and that looks good, I would check the turbo for in and out play just to be safe, because if it does have an upgraded wheels that are like more extreme than what we do, then the problem can be that the thrust bearing was never strong enough to be able to support that. Here's a great example of an aftermarket thrust bearing from an upgraded turbo that had problems. If you ever get the chance to take apart an upgraded turbo, sometimes it depends on what company you get it from. If they have this type of steel bearing, it just doesn't work out usually. And the reason why is because you're supposed to have really high content zinc in your oil, and most oils just don't have that. But I don't like to use this stuff anyway, just because it creates more problems than it's worth. But what I do is I just have them made in like a brass copper material, because it's a lot more sturdy and it's OEM material, so you just can't go wrong with that. But it is good to have that dual oil port design. This one's actually a triple oil port, so we do use like a dual oil port thrust bearing in our TD04 series, and I'm working on it for the TD03s still. However, it doesn't seem like it's been necessary to have it for the TD03s. If you ever put used parts on your engine, especially something that has to do with oil going through it, if you happen to get contamination in it, or if you got it off a junkyard part that there was a lot of dirt around it, that dirt can go into the turbos and cause a lot of problems. To give you an idea, it can block up the thrust bearing, and then if that happens, it just blows oil, because the thrust bearing wears out and it gets this in and out play, and it wears the seals out really fast. The other thing that can happen is if dirt gets down into the turbo, it can seize up the bearing and just cause the bearings to burn up to the shaft, because it's blocking off the oil pressure to it, and that will cause a big issue too. Another thing to check that could be blowing oil is if your bearing housing is worn out to where it won't hold the seal closed. So here's a brand new one. So the gap should be very, very minimal. See, this should be really common sense that that's not going to work. One thing that may surprise you is the gap on the Power Stroke 6.0 rear seal, because this one, to me, it looks like that's too much gap, but for some reason that's just the way they came from factory. That's how I've always rebuilt them, because I've checked every housing and it's got that much gap to it. If you guys have any more questions, you can always comment those below and I'll try and answer them for you.